by not being aware of it, I think you have a really high chance of spending a lot of time and money and energy on trying to fix something without really knowing what's causing the problem, and then, maybe having less success than you really hope for.
My name is Katharina, and I'm the Community and Event Manager at eCulture, a company that is on a mission to shape the world of unbiased hiring. Welcome to the Oops, I'm Biased podcast. On this episode of the Oops, I'm Biased podcast, I am speaking to Annie Russell yet again. She's been on the podcast once before. Today we are covering outcome bias. This is quite a big bias. That's why our bias deep dive today is a bit longer than the usual. We're going to talk all about outcome bias, where it comes into play in the real world, in recruitment, but also in product. This is where Annie is most well-versed in. And then we're going to talk a lot about the consequences of outcome bias and how you can minimize that. So stay tuned until the end to hear about those really valuable pieces of advice and best practices that Annie shares. Now, without further ado, I hope you enjoy this episode. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Oops, I'm Biased podcast. In this little series about bias deep dives, we are covering outcome bias today. I have Annie Russell on, a really dear colleague of mine. She's going to help us understand the consequences, what exactly it is that outcome bias actually entails, and then also minimize the impact of it. I won't give too much away. Annie, welcome to the podcast. It's your second appearance. Really excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me again. I've really enjoyed recording these, and I think outcome bias is super interesting to me. I'm part of the product team at eCulture, so it's one that is super relevant to my day-to-day work, and I've really enjoyed the research and learning more about it, to be honest. I think, it's going to be an interesting conversation.
Cool. Well, I won't go then too much on my rambling sprees, as probably returning listeners know that I'd like to talk. Give us a definition of outcome bias. What is it exactly?
Yeah. So outcome bias is a bias that you experience when you already know the outcome of a scenario. So it's when you just base your decisions on outcomes of previous events without really considering the factors or the events that happened before that outcome, and you really overemphasize how important that outcome is. I guess another similar bias to that is hindsight bias. But the difference here is outcome bias actually completely ignores the past events, whereas hindsight bias is more about distorting what happened beforehand. Outcome just tends to completely forget about it and overlook them. So
interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, you gave us another one that we should probably cover in the future. Hindsight bias. It's also not on our bias glossary yet. So might be one to add and have a conversation about at a later point. But sounds like a bit of a difficult one to grasp, saying, well, you're really completely negating what happened. You're just happy that the outcome is such. Could you give us an example of sort of either your work life or your day-to-day, what outcome bias actually looks like in the wild?
Yeah, I think this is one that I found quite a interesting and example online for, and it made it quite easy to grasp. And it's actually kind of a medical example. So you have two doctors. One of them sees this patient and does a really thorough physical exam and really gets down to the bottom of the problem, figures out what's wrong, and then follows the standard advice of the industry and decides to move forward with surgery to treat this kind of rare disease that this patient has. But because of that operation, the patient actually has quite a negative outcome. And so when you compare that to a doctor who sees that patient and kind of rushes through everything and doesn't really have time to listen or to do any further tests, and doesn't identify the disease or the problem with the patient, that doctor sends the patient home, and the patient doesn't have any negative effects from the surgery and is actually much happier and has a higher quality of life afterwards. You actually you can look at that. The outcome bias really comes in when you look at that, and it seems like that second doctor did a better job because the patient had a better outcome. But that first doctor made all the right decisions, but it's just that the patient, didn't respond well to the surgery. So it's really having the same decision, when you perceive the same decision to be lower in quality when it leads to a bad outcome. So if that patient had, if that doctor decided to operate and that patient died, you would have a really negative perception of that doctor's ability to make decisions. But if that patient survived and was all fixed, from that same doctor making the same decision from that surgery, you perceive it much better and much higher quality of decision, even though it's the same decision.
Wow. I mean, that is a very clear example. I think hopefully not a lot of people experience this firsthand, but I think it's a very illustrative example of how it actually works. I think we can all, probably listening to this as well, listening to you talk, remember a time where this happened in our personal lives in terms of just completely sidestepping the process and just really focusing on the outcome, saying, well, it led me to this, so I guess it must have been a good process. Do you have an example of your work actually where this might be coming into play in product?
Yeah, I think it's a big problem, I think, in product and quite across it's a software industry for certain. And I think an example is really looking at the outcome of something that you've done. So you're looking at maybe the usage data of a new feature that you've launched, and that usage data is through the roof and everybody's using it. And so that's the outcome you're kind of going for. You want what you release and work on to be well used. But it doesn't actually mean that feature is successful or a positive user experience. For example, if you added an extra step to a core part of your product, say for us in the creating a job, you're going to get a very high usage of that button because it is necessary to do the main value out of main task or get the main value out of the product. But it's actually blocking users from completing things efficiently or annoying users or impacting their workflows. And so although that usage is really high and that's the outcome you were going for, it's not a good user experience and it's not something that you should continue adding or continue doing.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like this is a really great example as well, that sort of you could almost one-to-one lay on a recruitment process. Say if you add a step in your recruitment process, yes, everyone's going to go through that step. Doesn't mean your candidate experience is actually improving. It might just be also on the decline for that reason. Could you give us maybe another example in the recruitment world where outcome bias is really impacting hiring decisions or processes?
Yeah, I think especially in the recruitment world, yeah. And I mean, I guess it's similar in a way to product, but you can really see it through KPIs and those key kind of performance metrics that you have. So if you look at things like the time to fill, you might have a quick hire, someone that you hire really quickly and they turn out to be really successful. And you go, wow, this person that we hired, we found them really fast and it was a big success for us. So you kind of prioritize shorter, making that time to fill shorter. You're relying on that metric, but you're not really considering the other factors that made that hire successful. And maybe there's other things that that led in, and it was more luck that it was a quick hire that turned out to be very successful. And then, I mean, other KPIs as well, you can also see the same thing. Maybe on a negative side, you might have for your employee retention rate as a KPI, but you have really high turnover of a lot of the recently hired employees. And so from that outcome, maybe you conclude that, the recruitment process was poor. But it's another thing that, you really need to be looking at the other factors that might play a role. But really easy to make that assumption that just because the people who were hired recently have left, that it was a bad hire and there was something in the recruitment process that was bad. But just like the same the other way around. You hire someone who's high quality of hires, and so you assume that your recruitment process is highly effective.
Yeah. And then with that, you can always justify anything that might not be either objective or inclusive or fair in the hiring process, just by saying, well, we hired this person this way and they're now a top performer. That sort of retroactively almost certifies your hiring process, and you're saying, well, we need to do this again because it worked out quite well, or sort of doesn't matter how we did this because the outcome was good. So say unstructured interviews, potentially saying, well, we asked them these questions, doesn't really matter, that they're doing well now. Is that sort of along the lines? Am I getting that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it really kind of leads to a struggle to make impactful change, to your hiring process or to do anything different or that side of things. If you if you see, oh, that one person, we really like her, she's great. Hiring process must be great. So why would we change it?
Yeah. So a bit of sort of that the reluctance to change then is one of the consequences that comes out of outcome bias. What other consequences do you envision if outcome bias has a really tight grip on recruitment?
Yeah, I think the main things are not being able to identify or kind of solve any problems that you are having in your hiring process. And that could be, a range of things. Maybe it's a lack of diversity. Maybe it's a high drop-off rate during the application process. It could also be missing out on really high potential candidates, or just really a chance to improve the lives of your recruiters even, and value them, or with that retention rate, which is the opposite kind of thing, where you have that negative outcomes, you assume your process is poor, then maybe that causes you to really try and change your hiring process, even though there might be some really good things in there. And it's by not being aware of it, I think you have a really high chance of spending a lot of time and money and energy on trying to fix something without really knowing what's causing the problem, and then maybe having less success than you really hope for.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like it's a grave problem to have outcome bias be impacting your recruitment process or your standard procedures or your hiring decisions so much. Now, I can hear the listeners think, what can you then do to minimize the impact of outcome bias? Do you have any tips or advice there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is a hard one. And I think it's also one that can have quite big effects, but they're quite long-term effects. It's not like some of these other biases that we've been talking about. This is one that you're not going to notice for 6 months or a year or things like that. And so, I think the first thing and, thing that is relevant for every bias is to, be more open-minded, be aware of your biases, and be ready to combat them. But yeah, I think for this one specifically, looking at your KPIs and making sure that what you're measuring with your KPIs are actually the things that make an impact, and that they're not, I guess, vanity metrics. They're things that actually help your business and your department reach that larger goal. I think that's definitely important. I think measuring the right things can help to change the view of what success looks like, and what causes that success. But also looking at standardizing things, using consistent objective criteria to try and make sure that you are considering all of the different factors that play into a successful hire and a successful recruitment process. I think we also kind of mentioned that this is more of a longer term problem often. So trying to make sure that you're reviewing your recruitment process over a longer period. I think one that comes to mind at the moment, and really relevant from my product experiences. We have a lot of projects focused at the moment on making sure that we are reviewing the quality of the hires and our quality of our recommendations that we make with our game-based hiring and assessments to 6 months down the track, that these candidates that we're saying are high performers, that they are continuing to actually benefit the company and really be those high performers. And so then, or if they're not, looking at the traits and looking at, where are we seeing success, and is this recommendation that we made originally when we first onboarded still relevant, or do we need to adjust some things and change a few buckets around based on the candidates 6 months down the track? Really thinking about it over that longer period rather than just immediate outcomes of maybe candidate experience or time to hire. Making sure we're looking at all of those things to have a bit more of a balanced approach.
Yeah, those are really great pieces of advice and sort of guiding principles, I would almost call them, to sort of look at standardizing. Also, what I think we spoke a lot about in here is don't be afraid of change. You said this is quite a long-term, the bias has quite long-term effects on your recruitment process. So don't be afraid to actually question, are you measuring what you're supposed to measure? What does it actually say? And sort of don't be afraid to go back into the process and see, is this what we're doing just leading to a good example out of the blue, or are we actually making impact there? So I think that's some great advice. With that, we're already at the end of our episode. Thank you so much, Annie, for joining me on this one. This was definitely a bigger bias to cover. There would, I think, be lots more to talk about here. But maybe if our listeners have more questions, we can do a part 2 somewhere down the line. But thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Be sure to come back in 2 weeks' time. We're going to cover another bias on the podcast. It's not called Oops, I'm Biased for nothing. So do come back for those pieces of advice and deep dives into biases. Thank you so much to everyone who listened today, and hope to see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye.